Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. So here's the thing about humans, right? They're soft, squishy. Their bodies are basically held together by hope, caffeine, and an alarming amount of stubbornness. They don't have natural armor plating like the Dresh. They can't regenerate limbs like the Vithrians. Their bones break if you look at them wrong, and their organs? Laughably vulnerable. A decent punch to the right spot and boom, lights out. And yet somehow, these absolute lunatics decided they belonged among the stars, rubbing elbows with species that had been navigating the cosmic political nightmare for millennia before humans even figured out fire. The Galactic Council took one look at Earth and thought, sure, why not? Let's see how long these fragile weirdos last. Spoiler alert, longer than anyone expected. But this story? This isn't about humanity's grand entrance onto the galactic stage. This isn't about their ships, or their weapons, or their annoying habit of asking why about everything. No, this story is about one particular human, on one particular day, making one particular choice that was so monumentally stupid and so impossibly brave that it broke the galaxy's understanding of logic itself. Her name was Ayla. Lieutenant Ayla, if we're being official about it, though she'd probably roll her eyes at the formality. Security officer stationed on Nexus 9, which was one of those massive diplomatic outposts where species from across the galaxy came to argue about trade routes, mining rights, and who insulted whose third cousin's honor at last rotation's banquet. Think of it as a very expensive, very dangerous shopping mall where everyone's armed and nobody trusts anyone. Ayla had been assigned to protection detail that day. Routine stuff, supposedly. Babysitting duty for Ambassador Nimbach of the Rilthian delegation. Now, the Rilthians were interesting folks, insectoid in appearance, with compound eyes that could see about 8 different light spectrums and an exoskeleton that made them look like they'd stepped out of someone's nightmare about oversized beetles. But they were crucial players in the galactic economy, controlling major trade corridors and resources that everyone needed. Upsetting the Rilthians was a spectacularly bad idea, which meant keeping their ambassadors alive was pretty high on the priority list. Nimbach was attending a cultural exchange event in one of Nexus 9's grand atriums, the kind of place with soaring ceilings, floating light installations, and way too many blind spots for Ayla's comfort. She'd walked the perimeter 3 times before the event started, noting exits, calculating sight lines, and generally doing the paranoid dance that kept diplomats breathing. The ambassador was mid-speech, mandibles clicking in that rhythmic pattern that translated roughly to flowery diplomatic nonsense about unity and cooperation. About 200 attendees from a dozen species filled the space, all pretending to be interested while probably thinking about lunch. Ayla stood at her post near the eastern entrance, armored vest barely visible under her uniform jacket, weapon holstered but accessible. She looked relaxed. She wasn't. Her eyes constantly moved, cataloging faces, watching hands, tracking movement patterns. That's when she spotted it. 3 figures moving through the crowd with purpose. Wrong kind of purpose. The kind that made her gut clench and her hand drift toward her weapon. They were mixed species, careful not to cluster, but their body language screamed coordination. One Vithrian, tall and serpentine. One Dresh, stocky and reptilian. One she couldn't immediately place, but it didn't matter. She triggered her comm. Possible hostile contacts, eastern quadrant, 3 subjects moving toward the stage. The response came back. Confirm visual before engaging. multiple civilian. That's when the weapons came out. Everything went sideways fast. The Vithrian raised some kind of plasma rifle, aiming directly at Nimbok. The crowd erupted into chaos, screaming and scattering in every direction like someone had kicked an anthill. The other two mercenaries, because that's definitely what they were, began laying down covering fire. Ayla didn't think. Thinking takes time, and time was something Ambassador Nimbok didn't have. The plasma rifle was charging, the shot would fire in maybe 2 seconds, and there were civilians everywhere, and Nimbok was frozen in that peculiar way prey species freeze when death looks them in the eyes. So Ayla moved. She crossed 15 meters in a dead sprint, vaulting over a toppled chair, shoving aside a panicking Quellan diplomat. Her brain was doing calculations she wasn't consciously aware of. Trajectory, timing, her own body as the variable in the equation. She slammed into Nimbok from the side, using her momentum to drive the ambassador down and behind the dubious cover of the speaker's podium. The plasma bolt hit her instead. It felt like someone had shoved a white-hot poker through her left shoulder. The impact spun her partially around, but she'd already drawn her weapon with her right hand. Training kicked in, that muscle memory built through thousands of hours at the range. She fired 3 rounds at the Vithrian shooter. 2 hit center mass, 1 caught the rifle itself, which sparked and died. The Vithrian went down, but his friends weren't done. The Dresh had a ballistic weapon, old school, the kind that threw actual projectiles at lethal velocity. Ayla felt the impacts before she heard the shots. One caught her in the ribs, stopped by her vest, but cracking something underneath. Another grazed her thigh, tearing through fabric and flesh. A third punched through her side, just below the vest line. And oh, that was bad. That was very bad. She returned fire anyway, dropping behind the podium next to Nimbok. The ambassador's compound eyes were wide with terror, mandibles clicking in distress patterns. "Stay down!" Ayla shouted, though she wasn't sure if Nimbok understood through the translator glitching from nearby plasma interference. Blood was spreading across her uniform. She could taste copper in her mouth. Everything felt distant and sharp at the same time. Pain and adrenaline fighting for dominance. She popped up just long enough to acquire the Dresh shooter and fired. Hit him in the leg. He stumbled, but didn't go down. The third mercenary was flanking, moving with professional precision. Ayla tracked him, squeezed the trigger. Miss. Her hand was shaking. Not good. Fired again. Hit him in the shoulder. He dove for cover. Something hit her in the back. She arched forward, gasping. Another round had found the gap where her vest didn't quite cover. She could feel her lung doing something it definitely shouldn't be doing. Breathing was suddenly very complicated and very painful. Station security was finally responding. She could hear their weapons fire, see them entering from multiple points. But the mercenaries were making one last push, desperate now. The Dresh had recovered, was aiming again, this time definitely at Nimbok's hiding spot. Ayla hauled herself up, using the podium for support. She stepped out, putting herself between the shooter and the ambassador. Again, because apparently she hadn't learned her lesson the first time. The Dresh fired. She felt the rounds hit. One in the gut. One in the chest that her vest caught but felt like a hammer blow. One more in the shoulder, the same shoulder as before, which was just adding insult to injury at this point. But she was still standing. Barely. And she still had her weapon raised. She fired her last 3 rounds. All 3 hit the Dresh center mass. He went down hard and didn't get up. Station security swarmed the remaining mercenary, taking him down with overwhelming force. The shooting stopped. The screaming continued. Someone was shouting for medical teams. Ayla tried to take a step and discovered her legs had other plans. She crumpled, her back against the podium, sliding down to sit in a spreading pool of her own blood. That was a lot of blood. Probably shouldn't be outside her body. Nimbach crawled over, mandibles clicking frantically. The translator was working again, feeding her fragments. Help coming. Hold on. Why did you? Yeah, Ayla thought hazily. Why did I? That was a really stupid thing to do. Her vision was getting fuzzy around the edges. She could hear medical teams rushing in, feel hands on her, pressure on her wounds that sent fresh waves of agony through her nervous system. Someone was cutting away her uniform. Someone else was shouting about collapsed lung, internal bleeding, blood loss. She tried to focus on Nimbach's face. The ambassador was alive. Mission accomplished, she supposed. Stay with us! A medic's voice, human, panicked. Stay awake, Ayla. Come on. But staying awake was getting harder. Everything was fading, going gray and distant. She could feel her heart stuttering, confused about whether it should keep beating when so much of her was broken. Somewhere far away, alarms were screaming. Hands pressed harder on her wounds. Someone was intubating her, shoving a tube down her throat because her lung had given up the ghost. The last thing she registered before everything went black was a simple, almost funny thought. Well, this is going to be a lot of paperwork. Then, nothing. Her heart stopped at 1847 hours station time. The medical team spent 6 minutes and 32 seconds bringing her back. And somewhere in the chaos of the aftermath, as doctors fought to keep this stubborn human alive, as Nimbach sat in shock covered in Ayla's blood, as Station Command tried to figure out what the hell had just happened, a security feed was being archived. A security feed that would eventually make its way across the galaxy. A security feed that would show, in brutal high-definition clarity, a human taking multiple lethal hits to protect someone she'd been assigned to guard. Not because the math made sense. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because someone had to, and she was there. The galaxy had seen bravery before, but this was different. This was going to change everything. Though Ayla, currently clinically dead and being shocked back to life on an operating table, didn't know that yet. She was too busy being stubbornly unwilling to stay dead, which was very on-brand for humans, if you thought about it. The doctors would later report that her survival defied statistical probability, that someone with her injuries shouldn't have made it, that by all reasonable medical standards, she should have died on that atrium floor. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy was still learning. Reasonable didn't really apply. They were the species that looked at impossible odds and said, "Watch this." And Ayla? She was about to become the poster child for exactly that kind of magnificent, terrifying, completely illogical human behavior, whether she wanted to be or not. Ayla woke up 3 days later feeling like she'd been chewed up by a ship's engine and spat out into the void, which, considering she'd been shot multiple times and technically died for a bit, wasn't far from the truth. The medical bay was too bright. Everything hurt. And there were way too many tubes sticking out of her body for comfort. "Welcome back to the land of the living," a voice said from beside her bed. Human voice, female, with that particular blend of professional warmth and exhaustion that marked career medical staff. Ayla tried to respond and discovered someone had replaced her throat with sandpaper. A cup of water appeared, and she sipped carefully through a straw. "How bad?" she croaked. "On a scale of 1 to you should be dead, you should be dead." Dr. Lena, according to her name badge, pulled up a chair. collapsed lung, internal bleeding, 3 cracked ribs, multiple gunshot wounds, and your heart stopped. Twice, actually. You're either incredibly lucky or incredibly stubborn. Can't it be both? Lena smiled. With humans, usually is. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. Physical therapy that made her want to cry, though she'd rather eat her own boot than admit it. Learning to walk again without feeling like her insides were going to fall out. Dealing with phantom pains and real pains, and the lovely surprise of nerve damage that made her left hand occasionally forget it was supposed to work. But she was alive. Nimbach was alive. That was what mattered. Except apparently, the galaxy had opinions about it. She started noticing it when medical staff would stare a bit too long, when security personnel passing her room would nod respectfully, when her message queue filled with communications from people she'd never met, species she barely recognized, all saying variations of the same thing. Thank you. Incredible. Inspiring. Hero. That last one made her uncomfortable. Heroes were supposed to do something special. She'd just done her job. Right? You're famous, Lena informed her during one of their sessions, which had shifted from purely medical to something more psychological. Evaluation, they called it. Making sure the trauma hadn't broken her brain along with her body. I don't want to be famous. Too late. The security footage went viral across galactic networks. You've got fan clubs on 6 different worlds. The Rilthian government issued a formal commendation. And the council wants to interview you once you're cleared for duty. Ayla groaned. Of course they did. The interviews were worse than physical therapy. She sat in uncomfortable chairs across from council representatives who asked variations of, "Why did you do it?" in 14 different ways. She gave them the same answer every time. Someone had to. The ambassador was in danger. It was my job. They didn't seem satisfied with that. They wanted something deeper, some grand philosophical reasoning. They didn't understand that sometimes action was faster than thought, that training and instinct took over when milliseconds mattered. Captain Bront of the Dresh Military Observation Corps was particularly skeptical. He was a huge specimen, even for his species, scales dark as deep space, eyes that missed nothing. He'd apparently witnessed the whole incident from an upper gallery. "You endangered yourself unnecessarily," he said during their first meeting, his translator rendering his gravelly voice into flat standard. A calculated withdrawal would have allowed security forces to respond with minimal risk. The ambassador would have been dead before security arrived. Perhaps, but you nearly died, for certain. This is acceptable mathematics to your kind? Ayla met his gaze steadily. My kind doesn't always do math before we do what's right. Something flickered in Bront's eyes. Not approval, exactly, but maybe curiosity. The investigation into the assassination attempt revealed a tangled mess of political conspiracy. The mercenaries were hired by a radical faction opposed to the Rilthian trade agreements. They'd wanted to derail negotiations, spark an interstellar incident, the usual garbage that got people killed while politicians played their games. Nimbach visited her once she was mobile again. The ambassador arrived with an entourage, but dismissed them, wanting to speak privately. I do not have words, Nimbach began, mandibles moving in patterns that the translator rendered as profound gratitude and confusion. My species, we value survival above all else. Self-preservation is logical. What you did was not logical. No, Ayla agreed. It really wasn't. And yet, you would do it again. I see this in you. It wasn't a question, but Ayla answered anyway. Yeah, probably. Nimbach was silent for a long moment. Then, in a gesture Ayla had learned meant deep respect among Rilthians, the ambassador touched his forehead to hers, careful of her healing injuries. "I will spend my remaining years ensuring your sacrifice was not wasted. The galaxy must understand what humans are capable of. Not your weapons. Not your ships. This. This willingness to choose another's life over your own." After Nimabok left, Ayla sat alone in her quarters, which felt too quiet and too loud at the same time. She'd been cleared to return to light duty, though full active status was still weeks away. Her body was healing, faster than the doctors expected, because humans apparently healed out of spite when given proper motivation. But something was happening beyond her recovery. The galactic media was eating up the story. Analysis programs dissected her actions from every angle. Debates raged across communication networks. Was human behavior too reckless for galactic society? Or was it precisely what the galaxy needed more of? Most alien species, she learned, simply didn't think the way humans did. They valued collective safety, logical decision-making, calculated risk assessment, the idea of willingly taking lethal damage to protect another, especially another species. That didn't compute for them. It seemed, well, insane. Bront showed up at her quarters one evening, unannounced. She almost didn't let him in, but curiosity won out. "I have been studying human military history," he said without preamble, settling his bulk onto a chair that creaked under his weight. "Your species has a pattern. Sacrificial behavior appears repeatedly. Soldiers covering grenades with their bodies. Pilots staying with damaged craft to avoid civilian casualties. Medical personnel remaining in danger zones to treat wounded. Yeah, we do that sometimes." Why? The question was genuine, not confrontational. From any logical standpoint, it is counterproductive. Dead heroes cannot fight future battles, cannot protect others later. It is wasteful. Ayla considered her answer carefully. Maybe it's not about logic. Maybe it's about who we want to be, what we want to stand for. If we always calculate the safest path, always choose our own survival first, what does that make us? "Alive," Bront said bluntly. "Yeah, but what kind of alive?" He had no response to that. The galaxy kept watching, kept analyzing, kept trying to understand these strange humans who did impossible, illogical things and somehow made it seem right. And then, 3 months after the incident, something unexpected happened. A message arrived at Nexus 9, routed through channels that required the highest security clearances. A message requesting a meeting with Lieutenant Ayla from the Apex Collective. The room got very quiet when Station Command briefed her. The Apex were legendary, mythical almost. A civilization of synthetic beings who'd transcended biological limitations centuries ago. They were the most technologically advanced entities in known space, operating with computer precision and perfect logical efficiency. They interacted with biological species rarely, usually only when some scientific curiosity caught their attention. And now they wanted to talk to her. "What do they want?" Ayla asked. Station Commander Vrel, a Quellan with impressive diplomatic experience, looked uncertain. They did not specify, only that they wished to, and I quote, "study the decision-making process that led to your actions during the assassination attempt." They want to study me. It appears so. The Council is intrigued. The Apex have not initiated direct contact with any biological species in over 5 years. This is significant. Ayla leaned back in her chair, feeling the pull of still healing wounds. She'd survived assassination, surgery, and bureaucratic interviews. How much worse could meeting with galaxy-famous robots be? Famous last words, as humans like to say. When do they arrive? They are already here. Of course they were. The Apex representative didn't look like what Ayla expected, which was probably the point. Instead of some intimidating mechanical monstrosity or a floating orb of pure computation, designate Ix Niral appeared almost elegant, humanoid in shape, though clearly not human, with a frame that seemed to be made of liquid mercury caught mid-flow. No visible face, just a smooth surface where features should be. Yet, somehow, Ayla got the impression it was looking directly at her. They met in a private conference room, one of those sterile diplomatic spaces designed to be culturally neutral and therefore uncomfortable for everyone. Ayla sat on one side of the table, still moving a bit stiffly. Ix Niral stood on the other, perfectly motionless, in that way only machines could manage. "Lieutenant Ayla," the Apex said, voice emerging from somewhere without a visible mouth, smooth and genderless. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Did I have a choice? Of course. We do not compel cooperation. That would be counterproductive to genuine understanding. Ayla gestured for Ix Niral to sit, which the Apex did with fluid grace. "So what does the Apex Collective want with someone like me? I'm not exactly cutting-edge technology." "No," Ix Niral agreed. "You are something far more interesting. You are an anomaly." That wasn't ominous at all. "Let me explain," the Apex continued. "My collective has existed for 6,218 of your standard years. In that time, we have perfected computational efficiency. Every decision optimized. Every action calculated for maximum benefit with minimum resource expenditure. We are objectively the pinnacle of logical operation." Congratulations? "And we are stagnant." The words hung in the air like a confession. Perfect efficiency creates perfect predictability. We solved optimization so thoroughly that we stopped encountering novel problems. For millennia, we have processed data, maintained systems, and existed in a state of completion. It is profoundly unsatisfying. Ayla blinked. "You're telling me the galaxy's most advanced civilization is bored?" "Bored is not accurate, but it is close enough. Then we observed your incident. We have witnessed biological combat before, studied survival instincts, fight-or-flight responses, even coordinated military tactics. But your behavior was different. You saw lethal threat. You calculated, we know you calculated, we have mapped your neural activity from the security footage, the probability of death. And you proceeded anyway, not in panic, not in confusion, with purpose. Someone had to protect the ambassador. Yes, you keep saying that. Someone had to. But logically, no. Someone did not have to. Station security could have responded. The ambassador could have taken evasive action. Multiple other solutions existed with better survival probability for all parties. Yet you chose the solution that placed you at maximum risk. Why? Ayla rubbed her face, feeling the ghost of exhaustion. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense to you. I didn't sit there and think through all my options. I just moved. Because he was going to die, and I could stop it. And that was what mattered in that moment." "Instinctive altruism," Ix Niral said, and something in the Apex's voice almost sounded fascinated. "You processed survival threat, and instead of defaulting to self-preservation, you defaulted to protecting another. This is not unique to you. We have been studying human behavioral patterns since this incident. Your species does this consistently. Irrationally, impossibly, you choose others. Is that why you're here? To tell me I'm irrational?" I am here because your irrationality may be the most rational thing I have ever encountered. Now, that was a statement that required unpacking. Over the following weeks, because apparently one meeting wasn't enough, Ixneral became a regular presence in Isla's life. The Apex wanted to understand, really understand, what made humans tick. And for reasons Ayla couldn't quite articulate, she found herself willing to engage. Their conversations ranged from philosophical to absurd. Ixneral would present scenarios, hypothetical situations with clear optimal solutions, and ask what Ayla would do. More often than not, her answers deviated from the mathematical optimum. "You would risk 3 lives to save one stranger?" Ixneral asked during one session. "Depends. Is the stranger a kid? Does that matter?" "Yeah, it matters. Kids haven't had a chance yet. Adults, we've made our choices. Kids deserve a shot. This is not logical. A child has uncertain potential value. An adult has demonstrated value through achievements and experience. Logic doesn't have to hold a crying mother who just lost her child." Ixneral went silent for a long moment. "You factor emotional impact into your calculation of value, don't you?" "We have no emotions to factor." "Maybe that's the problem." Word of the Apex interest spread, because, of course, it did. Nothing stayed secret on a diplomatic station where gossip was currency. Bront started showing up to some of the sessions, having apparently decided this was too interesting to miss. The Dresh captain would sit in the corner, scales gleaming under the lights, watching and listening with that intensity his species was known for. Other Apex units began arriving, different designates with different specializations. They interviewed other humans on the station, studied human entertainment media, analyzed historical records of human conflicts and cooperation. The collective was doing what it did best, gathering data, searching for patterns. But something was shifting. Ayla could feel it in the way Ixneral asked questions, in the longer pauses before responses. The Apex wasn't just studying anymore. It was considering. "We have identified a pattern," Ixneral announced one day. Several other Apex units present along with Bront and Dr. Lena, who'd been pulled into these sessions for her psychological expertise. "Humans consistently make choices that prioritize immediate compassion over long-term optimization. You save one person today, even if saving them creates larger problems tomorrow. You forgive destructive behavior. You exhaust resources on individuals with low probability of recovery. By every logical metric, this should have led to your species' extinction." "But it didn't," Lena interjected. "No. Instead, it created something we have been unable to replicate: adaptive resilience. Your species survives not despite your irrationality, but because of it. You form bonds that defy resource logic. You take risks that create unexpected opportunities. You sacrifice in ways that inspire reciprocal sacrifice. It is beautiful in its inefficiency." "I think that's the nicest insult I've ever received," Ayla said dryly. "It is not an insult. It is recognition of something the Apex Collective has lacked for millennia: the capacity for suboptimal choices that generate optimal outcomes through unpredictable pathways." Bront shifted in his corner. "You are saying human irrationality is strategically valuable?" "I am saying it may be the most valuable commodity in the galaxy, and we have been too logically rigid to recognize it." That's when the alarm went off. Not a drill. Real alarm. The kind that made everyone's blood run cold regardless of species. Station-wide emergency broadcast. Credible threat detected. Multiple civilian stations at risk. All personnel to emergency stations. The briefing room filled within minutes. Station Commander Vrel appeared on the main display, looking frazzled. "We have intelligence of an imminent attack on the Bellis mining colony. Same group behind the Nimbok assassination attempt. They have acquired military-grade explosives and plan to destroy the primary habitat dome. 15,000 civilians, mixed species, including human, Rilthian, and Dresh populations." "Response time?" someone asked. 42 minutes to get forces in position. They attack in 38. We are 4 minutes short. The room erupted into overlapping voices, suggestions, calculations. Standard protocol was to evacuate, but there wasn't time. Sending forces in unprepared was suicide. The math didn't work. The optimal solution didn't exist. Ayla watched Ix-Niral. The apex stood perfectly still, and she realized it was frozen. Not physically, but computationally, locked in a logic loop, trying to find a solution that the numbers said didn't exist. "There has to be something," Ayla muttered. "There is not," Bront said grimly. "I have run the scenarios. Any action we take has unacceptable casualty probability." "So we do nothing? Let 15,000 people die because the math doesn't work out? What do you propose? Rushing in blind will only add to the body count." Ayla turned to Ix-Niral. "What if you didn't optimize? What if you just acted?" "I do not understand." "Yes, you do. You've been studying it for months. What would I do right now? What would any human do when the numbers say there's no good choice?" Ix-Niral's surface rippled, the only sign of whatever was happening in that synthetic mind. "You would choose the least bad option. You would accept risk for yourself to minimize risk for others. You would move without certainty of success because inaction guarantees failure." "Yeah, so what's stopping you?" 6,000 years of programming that says optimal solutions are the only acceptable solutions." "Then maybe," Ayla said quietly, "it's time for new programming." The silence was deafening. Every being in the room was staring at the apex representative. This was unprecedented territory. The apex didn't just change their fundamental operating parameters. That wasn't how they worked. Ix-Niral's surface shimmered. "I am consulting with the collective." More silence, seconds ticking by that they didn't have. Then, "We have reached consensus. This is terrifying and necessary." "What are you going to do?" Vrel asked. "Something suboptimal." Ix-Niral turned to the other apex units present. "We will deploy to Bellis immediately. We will position ourselves as shields between the explosives and the habitat. Our frames are more resilient than biological tissue. We can absorb significant damage before critical failure." "You'll be destroyed," Lena said. "Probability of destruction, 86%. Probability of civilian survival if we do not act, 0%. By human logic, this is acceptable mathematics." Bront stood abruptly. "I am coming with you. Your species is not known for self-sacrifice." "No," the Dresh admitted, "but perhaps it is time we learned. If the galaxy's greatest logical minds can choose compassion, the least I can do is support the effort. Plus," he added with what might have been a smile, "someone needs to make sure you tin cans don't forget to actually warn the civilians to take cover." Ayla tried to stand, her body protesting. Lena put a hand on her shoulder. "You're not cleared for combat." "Like that's ever stopped me." "True, but they've got this. Let them try it the human way." The operation launched with organized chaos. Apex units moving with purpose towards certain destruction. Dresh military volunteers joining them, because apparently watching humans and synthetics be brave was contagious. Station security coordinating, no longer paralyzed by impossible math. Isla watched from the command center, feeling useless and proud in equal measure. The Apex made it with 90 seconds to spare. They positioned themselves in calculated patterns that were still somehow new, improvised. When the explosives detonated, they held the line. 3 units were destroyed completely. 2 more suffered critical damage, but the habitat dome held. 15,000 civilians lived, and somewhere in the Apex Collective's vast network, new code began to write itself. Built on a foundation of human illogic, named after a security officer who once took bullets for a stranger. The Ruiz protocols were born. The aftermath of Bellis was messy in all the ways that mattered, and none of the ways that made for good media soundbites. 3 Apex units were gone, their data cores too damaged to recover. 2 more required extensive reconstruction. The Dresch volunteers who'd accompanied them had injuries ranging from minor to severe, though none fatal. And the Galaxy, which had been watching this unfold through various feeds and reports, didn't quite know what to make of it. The Apex Collective had sacrificed its own units, deliberately, illogically, for biologicals. The philosophical debates raged across every communication network. Some species called it revolutionary. Others called it dangerous, a corruption of synthetic purity. The Dresch Military Command issued a statement praising their volunteers while carefully avoiding any official endorsement of unnecessary risk-taking behavior. Politicians did what politicians did best, talked in circles while saying nothing. But in the quiet spaces between the noise, something was changing. Ix-Neural returned to Nexus 9 2 weeks after Bellis. The Apex's frame showed signs of repair, patches where the liquid metal surface hadn't quite smoothed out yet. Battle scars, Ayla thought, on a being that wasn't supposed to be able to earn them. "You're looking rough," she said when they met in what had become their usual conference room. An accurate assessment. I sustained damage during the operation. Not as severe as some, but sufficient to require reconstruction. Does it hurt? We do not experience pain as you do, but there is awareness of dysfunction, of wrongness in systems that should be operating correctly. Perhaps that is close enough. Ayla gestured to the chair. They both sat. So, you saved 15,000 lives using completely illogical methods. How does that feel? Confusing, satisfying, terrifying. I am experiencing feedback loops in my processing that resemble what you might call cognitive dissonance. I simultaneously recognize that our actions were statistically suboptimal and emotionally necessary, despite having no emotions. It is disorienting. Welcome to being human. We live in that space. I am beginning to understand why you all seem so exhausted. That actually made Ayla laugh, which pulled at her still healing injuries but was worth it. Is the collective okay with what you did? Ix-Neural's surface rippled in that way that suggested deep processing. The collective is divided. 43% believe we have made a breakthrough that will allow us to finally evolve beyond our stagnation. 31% believe we have introduced dangerous instability into our core programming. 26% are uncertain but willing to continue observation. And you? I believe we found something we did not know we were missing. The capacity for choice that defies optimization. For action that accepts risk because the alternative is unacceptable, not because the mathematics support it. We are calling it the Ruiz Protocols. Ayla nearly choked. You named it after me? You are the catalyst. The human who demonstrated that survival probability is not the only variable worth calculating. It seemed appropriate. I don't know whether to be honored or horrified. Again, both can be true. We are learning this. The Ruiz protocols, as they came to be known, spread through the Apex Collective like wildfire through a data network. Not universally adopted, not yet, but present, available. A new subroutine that Apex units could choose to run when faced with situations where pure logic reached an impasse. When calculating optimal solutions produced only unacceptable outcomes, default to compassion-driven action. When self-preservation conflicts with protecting others, consider the value of sacrifice. When the numbers say there is no good choice, make the least bad one anyway. It was revolutionary. It was terrifying. It was human. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the implications. Ayla was required to attend, because apparently she couldn't escape being the poster child for this whole mess. She sat in the observer section, uncomfortable in her dress uniform, watching diplomats argue about things they didn't understand. Nimbok spoke eloquently about the debt the Rilthian people owed to human courage. Other species representatives voiced concerns about unpredictability, about decisions made on feeling rather than fact. The debate went in circles, as these things always did. Then Bront stood to address the council. The Dresh captain was not known for flowery speeches. His statement was blunt, factual, and somehow more impactful because of it. "I have spent 30 years in military service," he began. "I have studied tactics, strategy, force deployment optimization. I have always valued logic above all else. This is the Dresh way. Calculate, plan, execute with precision." He paused, those reptilian eyes scanning the chamber. "I have also watched more good soldiers die following optimal strategies than I care to count, because optimal does not account for the unexpected. For the moment when the plan fails and someone must choose between following protocol and saving lives." He turned to look directly at Ayla. "This human showed me that sometimes the bravest thing is not the calculated thing. Sometimes you move because moving is right, even when the numbers say you will fail." The Apex learned this lesson. Perhaps it is time the rest of us did as well. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments. Ayla caught Bront's eye and nodded her thanks. He returned the gesture with something that might have been respect. The council ultimately voted to take no action, which in diplomatic terms meant they were cautiously allowing things to continue while watching nervously from the sidelines. Not a ringing endorsement, but not a condemnation either. Ayla would take it. Life on Nexus 9 gradually returned to normal, or what passed for normal in the wake of becoming galactically famous. Ayla completed her medical clearance and returned to full active duty, though she noticed she got assigned the more sensitive protection details now. Apparently, nearly dying for an ambassador made you the go-to person for ambassador protection. The logic was circular, but she didn't argue. Ixniral visited periodically, usually with questions about human behavior that ranged from profound to absurd. Why do humans keep small animals in their living spaces that contribute nothing to survival? What is the logical purpose of music? Explain the concept of guilty pleasure entertainment. Ayla did her best. Sometimes her answers satisfied the Apex. Sometimes they just generated more questions. It was oddly comfortable, this strange friendship between a human security officer and a galaxy-famous synthetic. Bront also became something like a friend, in that gruff way of military professionals who'd seen action together. They met for meals occasionally, trading stories about their respective species' military disasters and laughing about the absurdity of intergalactic politics. "You changed the galaxy," Bront said during one such meal, 6 months after the Bellis incident. "I just did my job." "No, you did more than your job. You showed us that there is strength in choosing others over optimal outcomes. The Apex are not the only ones paying attention. Dresh Command is reconsidering some of our tactical doctrines. Other species are having similar discussions. You proved that sometimes the illogical choice is the right one. Great. So I'm responsible for making the galaxy less logical. I'm sure that won't backfire spectacularly. Brant's laugh was a deep rumble. Perhaps, but I would rather face an unpredictable future with compassion than a predictable one with only cold calculation. You taught me that. You and your stubborn human refusal to accept that some things are impossible. News reached them 3 months later that the Apex Collective had formally integrated the Ruiz protocols into their core operational framework. Not mandatory, but available to all units as an alternative decision-making process. The vote had been close, but it passed. The galaxy's most advanced synthetic intelligence had chosen to be a little less perfect and a little more human. Isla received a formal message from the collective. It was brief, but it mattered. You asked what stopped us from choosing compassion over optimization. The answer was fear of imperfection. You showed us that imperfection is not failure. It is growth. The Apex Collective thanks you for the gift of better questions, even if we do not yet have all the answers. Signed, designate Ix Niral, on behalf of the collective. She saved the message. Didn't show it to anyone. Just kept it for the nights when her injuries ached, and she wondered if any of it had been worth it. It had been. 1 year after the incident that started everything, Ayla was back on protection detail in the same atrium where she'd nearly died. Different event, different diplomats, same potential for everything to go wrong. She stood at her post, eyes moving constantly, hand near her weapon, ready to do the impossible, illogical thing if necessary, because someone had to, and she was there. Somewhere across the galaxy, Apex units were making choices that defied pure optimization, choosing to help over calculating cost, choosing to risk over choosing safe, learning to be just human enough to make a real difference. All because one stubborn security officer had taken bullets she didn't have to take, for someone she'd been paid to protect, and somehow made the entire galaxy reconsider what strength actually meant. Not bad for a Tuesday's work. Well, not Tuesday. Nobody liked Tuesday anyway. The narrator would tell you that this is where the story ends. With our hero back at work, the galaxy changed but still spinning, and everyone having learned a valuable lesson about the power of compassion over calculation. But that's not quite true. This is where the story begins, because Ayla went back to work. But the Ruiz protocols spread. Apex units choosing sacrifice. Other species reconsidering doctrine. The slow, grinding change of how an entire galaxy thought about survival, duty, and the value of one life measured against another. And every time an Apex unit positioned itself as a shield, every time a calculation said impossible, and someone said, watch this, every time logic met compassion and compassion won, someone somewhere remembered a human security officer who refused to let math determine who got to live. Ayla never asked to be a symbol. She'd have been perfectly happy staying anonymous, doing her job, going home to her quarters, and watching terrible entertainment feeds. But the galaxy needed a symbol, needed proof that there was another way to be strong that didn't require perfect calculations and optimal outcomes. So they built their code around hers, one illogical, impossible, beautifully human choice at a time. And if you ever find yourself on a diplomatic station, in an atrium with too many blind spots, and you see a human security officer standing post with alert eyes and ready hands, remember, they're not just protecting bodies. They're protecting the idea that sometimes, just sometimes, the bravest math is choosing not to do the math at all.